So, Mark, I'm kind of curious to take your sense on just AI, how it's going to impact various kinds of jobs, what's going to disappear, and maybe a broader, sense of how it will impact the economy.
Yeah, so there's number one, there's just a lot of irony in what's happening right now because, if a year ago, if we had sat down, or frankly, even 3 months ago, sat down and said, okay, what is the order of concern? Mm-hmm. Like which jobs are we worried about, AI or robots replacing first and then later? You would have had sort of for most of the last, actually probably 20, 30, 40 years, you would have said, well, it's obviously the blue collar jobs that get replaced first, right? Because they have the least knowledge mm-hmm. content and you just have machines do those things. And then you would say it's going to be the white collar jobs that involve knowledge work, but not creativity, right? Because you can imagine automating those jobs. And then you would say it's the creative jobs that for sure are the safest, right? And so somebody who's who writes books or does PowerPoints or composes music or creates video game levels is probably safe. Sitting here today, it's like, oops, it's like the opposite of that, right? And so it's actually a lot of the creative jobs that are most directly hit, I think the fastest. And then it's the white collar jobs that are actually less creative that hit next. And then it actually turns out it's actually really hard a lot of the blue collar jobs are actually really hard to hit. And, we there was that whole panic, some years back about all the, long haul semi truck driver, jobs are going to vanish overnight. And, if you look around, there's still plenty of people driving semis today. And so it actually turns out a lot of the blue collar jobs are actually hard to we have a machine that can write you poetry about your company in Old English, but we do not have a machine that can unplug your toilet. Right. And we do not have a machine that can we don't have a machine that can do most things that, people do with their hands. We don't have a machine yet that can pack your suitcase. Right. We don't have a machine that can clean your bathroom. We don't have any of these things yet. Right. We barely have machines that can do pick, pack, and ship and for retail e-commerce. And even there's still a lot of people involved. And so there is this kind of amazing kind of ironic thing where it's the people who thought they were the safest who are probably actually the most exposed. Look, having said all that, this is going to become another, we've been through in the last 20 years, 2 rounds of what I would say high octane Luddism, Luddite fallacy, which is there was a panic in the 2000s about offshoring and outsourcing. It was going to kill all the jobs. And then in the 2010s, there was a media fueled panic about robots taking all the jobs. There's going to be another panic like that about AI, LLMs and chatbots and so forth taking jobs, in this next cycle. And look, there will be some level of job displacement, right? There are jobs, when the car came along, all of a sudden you didn't need as many blacksmiths, right? Putting shoes on horses. And so, there will be some level of job displacement. There will be some level of job churn for sure. Look, having said that, there's kind of 2 giant factors that I think are going to result in that not quite being what people think. So factor number 1 is people always underestimate the degree to which new technology actually creates new jobs. And so, look, virtually every job that anybody has today, and certainly every white collar job people have today as a consequence of technological advances in the last, 300 years, or more commonly even just in the last 50 years. I mean, just anybody who works with computers today, which is a huge percentage of the white collar workforce, those jobs wouldn't even exist if computers hadn't come along. And so there's just going to be enormous amounts of AI fueled job creation. And there's a whole conversation we could have about that. That's very exciting. And then look, the other thing is there are giant sectors of the economy that simply cannot be automated or AI'd or anything because they're regulated. And, they're very sharply and strongly controlled by the government. And, they are dominated by monopolies and cartels that have fundamental, monopoly, regulatory protection. They've got what the economists call regulatory capture. They control their regulatory agencies. And so you've got these giant industries like healthcare and education and housing and banking and law, right? And, most of what the government does, that where it's just, there will be the opportunity to bring AI to all those fields. It will actually be very hard to do so. Because those industries are wired in a way to be dead set against technological improvement. And so most of the economy, like I say, our biggest problem for the next decade is not going to be AI having too much effect. It's going to be AI having too little effect because there's just these huge swaths of the economy that are just off limits.
I want to talk about AI and sentience. And
I think one thing, just talking about sentience, sorry. Mark, you had done this podcast episode with, I think, Tyler Cohen, where you talked about, I think one of the questions was do you think AI is going to come in and take over humanity, what's that going to look like? And I remember you saying something like, it's math. I'm not afraid of math.
Right.
And I just don't think that is a thing that we should all be worried about now. And I guess, and I don't know where you were going with this, but to me, it's like, has that changed at all, given what you've seen so far?
Well, let me make a fun reference here. We were watching Star Trek Picard season 3, episode 1. Highly recommended. It was amazing. And in so many ways, I think for like a lot of us, like TNG. The greatest Star Trek show of all time. It really defined how we think of AI. All these classic episodes where you sort of generally knew Data was sentient, and there's all these classic episodes, for example, like when there's a trial about whether Data is like sentient or not, and you have like Riker defending him, and Picard opposing him, and the other way around, and then you get like sort of the the off switch, etc. And now, I never thought like those things would actually be relevant again in my lifetime. And recently, obviously, we had last year the Google engineer, who saw Lambda, Google's version of ChatGPT, say, and kind of pulled the alarm saying, "Hey, this thing might be sentient." Now, at the time, I would say the general reaction from the tech community was to kind of mock him a little bit, was to be like, "Hey, this thing's crazy, silly, like you're just a silly Silicon Valley person." I would say, though, after seeing some of the Sydney chat logs, I am sensing some people going like, this seems slightly different, and maybe there is some sympathy for Lemoyne, I think was his name. I am curious, Mark, to your question, which kind of version of Aarthi's question here, which is, A, has your opinion on AI sentience changed? And B, maybe more interestingly, when will you admit or realize, hey, this
admit
okay, or acknowledge, or what will be the crossing of the Rubicon for you to go, okay, it passes the Marc Andreessen version of the Turing test?
So a couple things. So the story of AI sentience, right, as it exists today in the technological community, and you can kind of get this from Ray Kurzweil, or you can get this from Eliezer Yudkowsky or others, right? The basic story is it's one of sort of emergent sentience, right? And so the theory is basically we have these algorithms, we have these data sets, we have these computer clusters. They're rising in complexity. There's literally more and more math, more and more numbers, more and more data, more and more algorithms, more and more loops running. And then they kind of chart it against like the complexity of like the mouse brain, and then the monkey brain, and then at some point the human brain, and then superhuman brain. And they're like at some point it's like magic happens. Like there's a moment where it basically becomes self-aware. And this is the Terminator thing, right? Skynet will just like wakes up. The show I mentioned earlier, Person of Interest, the same thing happens. Like the thing just kind of wakes up. And the problem with actually, no, let me take that back. Person of Interest, it's not clear that happens. I'll take that back. I'll come back to that. But it definitely happens in.
We just have to watch that show now. We were big fans of Law and Order SVU back in the day, like I think 20 years ago when you first moved in here.
No, I would say there's a bunch of. This is a very common trope in sci-fi. I would say the AI waking up. But sorry, we're getting on tangent here, Mark.
The problem is like it's a massive hand wave, right? So it's like, okay, what is the hardest problem in all of technology that the smartest minds have been working on for the last 70 years, starting with Alan Turing, is to generate artificial intelligence. Do we have a way? Do we know how to design sentience? Do we know how to do we have a method by which we can create something that we know is sentient? Like, can we create something that's analogous to human brain? No, we can't. We don't have the first clue how to do that. Do we understand how the human brain works? Do we understand how human sentience works? We have no idea. We have no clue. Fun fact, the category of the biological research medical community that best understands the nature of human consciousness is anesthesiologists. They know how to turn consciousness off.
That's right.
And then back on again, which was a big breakthrough when they figured that out. They still don't have a clue like what it is, like how to do it. Like nobody does. Nobody understands how the brain works. Like it's not. When I went to college in the late 80s, I was actually going to go into what was called cognitive science at the time, which is basically exactly this. It was the study of the brain, and then it was basically how to make computer algorithms that replicated that. And it was because we get very clear, like we don't have the first clue. So we still don't have the first clue how the brain does what it does. We still don't know how to wake up a computer. And so this idea, there's a massive hand wave in all these theories, which is like it's just kind of like spontaneous simultaneously happen. And so you just have to kind of wrap your head around the idea that like the most amazing technological breakthrough of all time is going to just kind of happen magically, accidentally. And so I'm like, I don't see that. And there's a longer conversation we could have about there's this deep-seated kind of, I don't know, mythological, cultural, emotional thing in sort of human culture. This goes back to like the myth of Prometheus and like the Frankenstein story, where basically it's this technology that basically ends up turning on, delivered by the gods, that it basically ends up turning on man. And this would be the ultimate version of that. And I don't see that happening. I think there's a much more interesting question, which gets to the heart of what you alluded to, which is when people are using these things, and in particular when people got their 4 days of being able to talk to Sydney before she was shot in the head, cruelly executed.
She's not quite dead yet. Not quite dead yet.
Yeah,
she's staggering around, man. She's
by the way, can I say, Stephen, you'll appreciate this. Can I say Star Trek Next Generation absolutely nailed the analogies to what is happening right now? Like, for example, Sydney is Lore, Data's brother, right? What happens? Dr. Sung creates Lore first, too human, too evil, Lore gets shut down, and what do? You get ChatGPT, which is a slightly more Android-y, palatable version of AI. So TNG was ahead of its time. Sorry, Mark, go on.
Yeah, so look, people have this reaction. Like they have this reaction, right? So what I just described earlier was like the technological perspective, but then there's the human perspective, which is people have this reaction to it, right? And it's like, okay, why are people having this reaction to it? And for me, it gets to this like really fundamental underlying question, which is like, okay, like what does it mean? Like what does sentience actually mean? What does it mean for a human being to be sentient? Like, are we actually all that positive that there's actually like all that magic happening upstairs in our minds? Like how deep do we go? How shallow are we actually? There's a whole thing on this. It's very interesting. There's a whole theory on this, which basically is like the human brain is actually not that sophisticated. Like basically we're improvising on the basis of basically bad memories. We kind of live life 15 seconds at a time. And a lot of what we do is just kind of auto-completing, right? Like
definitely on this, definitely when preparing for this podcast, that's how we roll. That's how we roll.
Correct. Exactly. Well, a lot of what happens in a conversation is we're kind of I'm doing it right now. Like I'm speaking on the fly. I'm trying to kind of auto-complete the sentence that I started. I kind of have a vague awareness of what's going to happen in the near future. I have these sort of vague memories of what we talked about even, 30 minutes ago. I have like almost no memories of what we talked about last week. And I'm just like doing my best. I'm just like pedaling along, doing my best. And when I autocomplete, sometimes I get things right. Sometimes I get things wrong. Sometimes I make stuff up. Sometimes you can't tell when I'm making stuff up. Sometimes I can't tell when I'm making stuff up. And so, there's this other kind of take on it, which is this is actually not a question about the AI. It's actually a question about us. It's a question of like, okay, what does it actually mean for a human to be intelligent? And are we actually sort of, are we imputing into the machine things that aren't there, but in the process we're learning from the machine about maybe things about ourselves that we weren't fully aware of? The Turing test is the great example of this, right? And so it's like the Turing test, like the whole basis of the Turing test is is the machine so advanced that basically you can't tell when you're talking to it whether it's a human or a machine, right? That's the way that the test is kind of framed. But there's another way of looking at that test, which is the machine basically good enough at what it does to be able to trick a person? Right. And like any con man will tell you, or any magician will tell you, like human beings are not that hard to trick.
Right.
Right. And so how much of an accomplishment actually is it to trick us into thinking that it's real when it's not, or that it's alive when it's not? And so I tend to think all of these questions around sentience and so forth, they're actually much less about the substance of what's actually happening under the hood on the machine side. They're more about us and how we perceive the world and how we perceive the things we value and the experiences that we have. And I think there's like 1,000 questions in that realm that have opened up all of a sudden. Basically, the machine is sort of reflecting those questions back on us.
It's also the Turing test was this. It's sort of this gold standard, but it's based on like these super well-versed people in this constrained environment. It was even literally a contest. But another view of it is like in 3 years, if you're trying to reschedule a flight or book dinner reservations or something, and you're dealing with the future Sydney, and you get a satisfying result from that experience, are you really the next step to debate whether it was sentient or whether it just worked? And so if the startups do their job, there will be hundreds or thousands of interactions that become AI-based interactions, and you just don't care. But that, to Mark's point, we're no closer to like wanting to, go hang out on a desert island and live with an AI for the rest of time. Although maybe, that would probably be a bad example for present company, but in other rooms and other audiences. But it is going to happen. It's just going to happen in a very different way. It's not going to be this invention. It's just going to be a series of these things.
Let me just make one more science fiction observation, because I love all the same science fiction you guys were referring to. I'm actually rewatching Person of Interest right now because it all of a sudden is like super relevant. Here's the other science fiction observation. This is really interesting, and this goes to cultural perceptions of technology and how we're going to react to this. So basically, science fiction for the last 50 years or even longer that involves AI, basically the implicit assumption is like immediate hostility, right? And so it's basically two storylines. Either the machines are going to be fascist with respect to us, which is the Terminator storyline, which is the machines are going to declare war on us and put us in camps and then exterminate us, right? Which is literally what happens in those movies. And then, or we're going to be fascist towards the machines. And that's like the Philip K. Dick Blade Runner scenario, right? Yeah. Like, right. If you watch Blade Runner, the presumption is, there are these AI, androids running around, and humanity's response is to hate and fear them and want to kill them. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it's sort of this immediate fascist frame where if you've got these two different kinds of entities, basically humans and AI, that they're inevitably going to go to war with each other and try to exterminate each other. If you actually look at what's happening when people interact with even ChatGPT or Sydney or Bing Chat, even in their, even in their, let's say, hobbled forms, like they're having the exact opposite reaction. They love it. Like they love these things. This is what happened to the guy at Google. Like he fell in love with the thing. Like he's like, wow, like I found another soul. Right. And people are immediately having that reaction. There have been a handful of science fiction movies. The movie Her comes to mind where they've actually had this. But like, it's actually the opposite reaction. We actually arguably, like right out of the gate, we can see arguably humans like have a giant bias towards having sympathy and maybe even too much sympathy with basically what are at the end of the day, basically slightly more sophisticated toasters. And so it may be that the way that this evolves actually is we way overestimate, or let's put it this way, our level of sort of emotional affect and emotional loading that we place on these things is going to be way out ahead of whatever the underlying reality is. And maybe that's actually going to shape how this unfolds much more than this reflexive impulse towards having some sort of hostility.